Shabbat Shalom. So, in the triennial reading that we do here today, we read exclusively from the first half of our double parasha in Parashat Behar. The Israelites still have not moved from the foot of Mount Sinai after all this time, but the text of the parasha suggests that Israel will be on the move once again very soon. We're still in the prolonged part of Sefer Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, known to Bible scholars as the Holiness Code, which began way back in chapter 17 and concludes in chapter 26. The later section of the code, where we are today, fleshes out the calendar's important holidays and seasons, and we learn about the rules of Shemitah and Yovel, agricultural and societal reset years that bring a certain balance to the earth, so that, as the text says in chapter 28, verse 25, verse 18, we may live on the land securely. Lavetach. The Holiness Code shares a vision of our people's future located at the place of our people's formation. And we open today's reading on a remarkable instruction from God about our impending arrival to the Promised Land. While we might think that our arrival in the land would feature a time of endless abundance, or that the culmination of this journey from slavery and abject poverty would be a celebration of plenty, instead, we're instructed in chapter 25, verse 2, to observe a Shabtah Haaretz, Shabbat Ladonai, a Shabbat for the land, a Shabbat of God. After all that momentum and buildup, our arrival is marked with stopping. Not just the ceasing of movement, but of engaging with the earth itself. And granted, verse 3 quickly explains that this Shabtah Haaretz is not immediate, but is something that we should implement every seventh year, so we can adjust our understanding slightly. Before we even take possession of the land, we are tasked with mentally preparing ourselves to relinquish our control over it. But I'm also struck by how the instructions for the system of Shemitah, the term that eventually comes to replace Shabtah Haaretz, is set up in the same pattern as the Omer, which we learned about last week. The Holiness Code builds on its teachings in the way the best curricula do, with each lesson revealing something deeper at each stage. It's good teaching. The instructions of the Omer are addressed to the collective. In chapter 23, verse 15, the Hebrew reads, Usfartem lachem. You all count these 7 weeks, these 49 days. Count as a people and learn as a people to use the calendar I've given you so that you can understand the responsibilities that come with being free, that come with being masters of your own time, and as harvesters of your own grain. In turn, the instructions in today's reading about the Shemitah are addressed in the singular. Chapter 25, verse 8 tells each of us, V'safarta lecha, count for yourself these 7 units of 7 years each, totaling 49 years before the Jubilee, before the Yovel. We first learn to count in rounds of 7 as a collective, and then we drill down into what that means for us individually. That there is perhaps a smaller level of responsibility felt as we learn to be part of a group during the Omer, and then we're set up to take on greater responsibility and deeper thinking on our own in learning about Shemitah. That's scaffolding. It's great pedagogy. But the Omer and the Shemitah Yovel systems remind us that the covenant we share with God always has a third party in play, the land. That our service to God never exists in isolation, that our tradition cannot survive in a vacuum, but requires a planet in order for that tradition to be meaningful. That as Jews, it is essential that we pay attention to the seasons and to the way our natural inclination to harvest and to take and to use and use and use affects the land's ability to sustain us. We are partners with God on a spiritual level for sure. We knew that from Sinai. But from the Holiness Code and the lessons of Shemitah and the Omer, we learn that we also are members of this covenant on a material and a physical level as well. I'm going to credit our own Alan Palmer with this insight that in giving us teachings about how we manage the land, we are reminded that God is attempting to instruct one set of God's creations, humans, in how to share responsibility over another set of God's creations, everything else on the planet. And even this thing we do, called prayer, plays into that relationship. It requires something of the earth. We need trees for paper, and plants for ink, and oil and coal to power the printing presses and trucks that deliver the sidurim into our hands. And we have always marked sacred time with lechem min haaretz, bread of the earth, and pri hagefen, fruit of the vine. Even if we are no longer farmers like our ancient ancestors, the way we interact with and care for the planet remains as important to our Jewish practice now as it always has been. I think that's part of why, interspersed throughout the Holiness Code, and especially in sections like our reading for today, we get these tiny reminders to be good people, to not harm others, as we see in chapter 25, verse 14 and 17, Al ton'u ish et achiv, velo ton'u ish et amito, respectively, that a person should not hurt their sibling, and that they should not wrong their fellow. Again, the magic of this pedagogy shines through. I'm going to get you to think about the land you're living off of, says God. And then I'm going to have you look your neighbor in the eye, the one who's hungry and whose field didn't produce enough this year, or the one who needs a little financial boost to get through a tough time. You're both standing on something you share, the earth, and you're both responsible for doing right by it. It seems that the Torah teaches us that the land is the great equalizer, the thing we all come from and go back to. Maybe the earth won't produce triple its normal yield every 7 years, as the text tells us it will. But for sure, the earth's natural tendency leans towards balance, and it can take care of itself. The Shemitah system is meant to teach us that to keep that sense of balance near to our hearts as we embrace the abundance of our harvests. And as the days grow longer and warmer in this part of the world, we're entering a time of abundance. Though, things being as they are, it may be the case that for many of us that abundance may be harder to come by, and that engaging with the earth is even more difficult than normal. So I'll encourage those of you that have the opportunity to get outside, to grow and to garden and to be in nature in some sort of way, to pay attention on a greater level to what the earth does for you and what you're doing for it in return. And if you have the means, perhaps this is the time to join a CSA and directly support farmers in the tri-state area who often go unrecognized for the vital role they play in sustaining millions of people. Relatedly, I encourage all of us to look into opportunities to combat hunger in New York this summer. I think there's going to be a greater need than normal. And my blessing for everyone here is that while we live through this period of forced simplification and a time in which we are all learning to make do with less access to sunlight, less access to yeast, less access to human connection, we concentrate our efforts to nonetheless do right by one another. We owe God and the earth that much, at least. Shabbat Shalom.